just want to extend a great deal of gratitude for you folks taking an hour out of your Thursday evening to talk about the HCP with us. And a big thank you to Bridget for being here tonight. So Coalition for the Deschutes is a nonprofit organization that works to protect and restore the Deschutes River so fish farms and families can thrive. We wear many hats, including spearheading this shared vision for the Deschutes, which calls for a restored river with healthy flows, modernized irrigation infrastructure from river to farm, and ample water for our growing communities. Along with our Shared River campaign, another huge part of our role in the basin lies in educating and engaging with the community. And we do so to accelerate these fundamental shifts in how the Deschutes is managed. And that's really why we're here today. Coalition has the pleasure of hosting this Zoom meeting to help our community learn all there is to know about the Deschutes River Habitat Conservation Plan, also known as HCP, in 60 minutes. And who better to teach us than Bridget Moran? Bridget is a field supervisor with the Bend Field Office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She manages a team of biologists working on a variety of conservation efforts in Central Oregon, including implementation of the HCP in our basin. So with that, please help me in welcoming Bridget by ensuring your microphones are on mute and your video is off. We ask you to do so just to maintain bandwidth so that we can run through the presentation smoothly. We've already received several questions from a lot of you from our meeting attendees tonight. And what's going to happen with this meeting is Bridget's going to run through some slides, inform us about HCP, and then those questions we've already received, I will read off of a Word document that I have where we've compiled all the questions, and Bridget will get to as many of those as possible tonight. If you have any questions that come up during the meeting tonight, please refrain from asking them and instead type them into the chat. We will get them added to that Word document. And then if we don't have time to get to them tonight, we are going to be putting together kind of a Q&A document that we can then circulate out to our meeting attendees. And we're also going to post it on the Coalition website. So before I turn it over to Bridget, are there any questions from folks on meeting format? Why we're having you turn off your cameras, anything there? Okay, wonderful. Well, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bridget, and thank you all again for being here. Bridget.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you everybody for taking the hour out of your evening to hear about the HCP. Before I get into it, Holly, I just wanted to ask if I share my screen, am I still going to be able to see people to admit?
I believe that Brooke just took over host duties, so she should be able to see people coming into the meeting to admit.
Okay. If not, I will try to multitask on that.
Okay.
Okay. Well, again, thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight. I have about 10 slides. I didn't make a very long presentation because I know from experience that folks really like to ask questions and then understand things at a deeper level on different areas. So I'm going to go over the Deschutes Basin HCP at a fairly high level. I have provided a document that has all of the actual conservation measures, the actual meat of the HCP and the monitoring requirements. It's about a 20-page document. So that sort of explains why I'm not going to go into that much detail on every single one of them, but I'll touch on those. But if folks have an interest in that, I'm sure Holly can share that with the group. So, and I might pull it up for reference if I need it. But in the meantime, I'm going to jump in and share my screen and get us going. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay, so once again, thank you. I'm Bridget Moran, Field Supervisor with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Very happy to be here. So first, I'm just going to very briefly touch on what are habitat conservation plans. Many folks on this call and have been to a lot of other meetings, so I'm not going to go into all of it, but I thought I'd just touch on it for the folks that may be new to it. So habitat conservation plans, or HCPs, are plans that are done by non-federal entities. That means not a federal agency. So these are done by state governments, local governments, private companies, all sorts of entities that have activities that could harm or do harm endangered species. And so it's a portion of the Endangered Species Act, Section 10, that provides the statute and regulations for how to work with non-federal entities to provide them a means to essentially become have their what I call otherwise lawful. And I say that a couple of times because it means that other things they're doing are legal, whether that's harvesting timber, delivering water, building developments, fishing, what have you. So in so doing those legal activities, though, when species either become listed under the Endangered Species Act, or if they already were and that activity goes into a new area, that can get run afoul with the Endangered Species Act. And so the habitat conservation planning tool provides us a means to provide a legal mechanism for people to continue that activity in a way that doesn't harm species. And the goal is that they're designed to benefit, to provide a conservation benefit to offset what the effect of the harm or the impact to the species might be. Some folks on this call I know work with federal agencies, and you hear us talking about Section 7 consultation, and that's the federal corollary. That's when we work with the Forest Service if they're doing a timber sale or building a trail or what have you. So we work under different portions of the Endangered Species Act for different entities. So the HCP portion is for the non-federal entities, and that's the portion we were acting under here. So the Deschutes Basin HCP, it was a 12-year planning process, quite a long process. We approved that plan on December 31st, 2020, and it is a 30-year plan. So HCPs can have can provide different lengths of duration, and they're typically tied to what the kind of built around the effect of the action or how the activity goes. And for instance, like we've had development HCPs where they're only a few years because the development occurs, and typically with a development HCP, the mitigation is purchase of another site. So the HCP itself is pretty short-lived. And then on the other end of it, we have timber HCPs that are in the 75 to even 100-year range now, because timber takes a long time to grow, especially spotted owl habitat. We tend not to do them so long anymore because we really can only issue a permit for as long out as we can analyze. And in this case, we felt confident with going with a 30-year permit. And we debated that, but we ended up with a 30-year permit term for this Deschutes Basin HCP. The HCP covers the Deschutes Basin reservoirs and streams where the Endangered Species Act listed species are present. And I'll show a map of that in a moment. For the Fish and Wildlife Service, we have 2 species covered under this plan: the Oregon spotted frog, which is in the upper basin, and bull trout, which is in the Crooked River and the lower basin. The permittees, the entities that we issued the permit to, are the Deschutes Basin Board of Control member districts and the city of Prineville. The Deschutes Basin Board of Control, or DBBC, member districts include Arnold Irrigation District, Central Oregon Irrigation District, Lone Pine Irrigation District, North Unit Irrigation District, Ochoco Irrigation District, Tumalo Irrigation District, Three Sisters Irrigation District, and Swally Irrigation District. I always have to count them out because don't want to forget anybody. So those entities came together to form the Deschutes Basin Board of Control, actually. And as such, now that group, each individual district and the city of Prineville are the named permittees in the plan. This is a map of the area covered in the HCP. This is actually the outline of the watershed of the Deschutes Basin. For many folks that sound like they've lived here for quite some time, we know that the Deschutes River flows north, which is always a little interesting for some of us, having rivers flowing north, but Deschutes River starts up in the upper basin, in the central Cascades, flows down through the city of Bend, continuing to flow north. Tumalo Creek joins, Waichus Creek joins, and then the Crooked River through Prineville joins at Lake Billy Chinook, and then continues through the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, and then out through Maupin up to the Columbia River. So the actual covered lands of the HCP, that's a term, the covered lands are the actual area where the plan is implemented. And for this plan, the actual covered lands are exclusively the reservoirs, the streams, and the adjacent land immediately adjacent to those rivers and streams where the species live and where they might be affected. And on this map, you can see that that's highlighted in a yellow highlight over the covered lands. The other interesting thing on this map is the colored areas that represent where the different irrigation districts are, as well as the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs land. So I mentioned the two species that are covered under the plan are the Oregon spotted frog and bull trout. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the spotted frog first and the conservation measures that apply to it, and then move on to bull trout. And I thought I'd show this map. I think many folks might be aware of this already, but spotted frogs are found essentially, well, for the purposes of this HCP. They're actually, the range of the spotted frog is actually from the Klamath Basin up to British Columbia. But for the purposes of tonight, I'm speaking exclusively of the covered lands within the Deschutes Basin for this HCP. And in that area, the spotted frog is found from Bend up to, or from the reservoirs down to Bend. And on this map, it's depicted in purple where the water management activities of the permittees affects the habitat for the spotted frog. We actually have spotted frogs in areas above and around the upper basin that are not a part of the managed water area. And those are depicted here in blue. But the purple area are the areas covered by the HCP where the spotted frog is found. And this is a photo of a spotted frog. There is no photo credit because I took it myself, which I should probably put the Fish and Wildlife credit on. There it is, for future reference. So the measures for the spotted frog, I mentioned a few moments ago that I provided a 20-page document that goes through all of the measures in great detail. The measures are very specific, and they provide really a very clear roadmap for how to measure compliance with the HCP. So I have generalized them here. I can speak to them in more detail as we talk through questions, but I just thought I'd speak to them in a more general fashion at first, and then we can get into some of the details if needed. So primarily, the spotted frog is an aquatic animal. It needs water for all of its life stages. And one of the main problems that we were trying to solve with the HCP is that the water was not in the time and in the space and time of where the frogs needed it to be to meet all of its life stages. And so in particular, we had to do different strategies in different places. And this kind of goes to some of the questions that I saw that we'll come back to later, where, and things I read in the paper all the time about this number or that number, or it should be, what, I can't tell you how many times I've been called by reporters and asked me like, what does the frog need? Like, the frog needs water. Well, how much? It's like, well, where do you mean that? It's a very complicated system. The upper basin has had water managed for over 100 years since the construction of the upper dam complexes. And as a result of that, storage of water in the winter and release of water in the summer, the physical structure of the river has been highly altered in such a way that no one number of can provide the frog the water it needs at all times for its different life histories. So I'll come back to that a little later, but in particular, what we do when we work on these plans is we start with the areas where we know the species are, and we optimize the conditions for them in those areas, and then try to enhance and expand those populations. So with that type of sort of basic conservation biology principle, we looked at the existing locations. And one of those locations within the water management area is Crane Prairie. That's the upper reservoir, up next to Wickiup Reservoir in the Central Cascades. And what we found there was actually a pretty healthy population of frogs. However, because the water was being pulled down for release in the summer, it was had the potential to strand frogs and not allow them to stay in the water and provide cover for, let people in as I see it pop up, provide cover from predators, whether that's birds or snakes or fish. So, and then in the winter, that reservoir was getting filled so high up to beyond where the vegetation is, so far high into actually up into the lodgepole pine forest there. And so at that time, when the frogs would then breed, it would be they would be way up into the lodgepole forest as opposed to down into the wetland vegetation where we needed them to be. And so one of the primary things we did right from the beginning was to work with the irrigation districts to stabilize Crane Prairie Reservoir. So the primary measure there's a maximum elevation that it can go up to. That elevation is held during the breeding season, and then through the rearing period over the summer, and then later in the summer that water can come down, but it goes down to a much higher level. So a much smaller amount of water comes out of Crane Prairie Reservoir than it historically has. Next, we modified the timing, volume, and frequency of reservoir releases. Now this little phrase has pages and pages and pages of specifics about how exactly the reservoirs are managed for different times of the year. But essentially the goal is to provide flows in the spring so that the spotted frog breeding habitats will be sufficiently wetted up and then stabilized to a certain extent so that it's not bouncing around or dropping the volumes out radically, or raising it so high to flush the egg masses maybe more into a stream channel. So really trying to bring those flows up to inundate the wetland sloughs and oxbows where the frogs like to get, and allow them to breed. And then over time, then as the irrigation season continues, we have some stabilization measures, things like once you go above a certain release out of Wickiup Reservoir, then you can't come down by too fast of a percentage so that we don't strand the frogs. So there's lots of detail about managing those flows so they don't bounce around too much. And then the timing and the holding things like later in the season, as opposed to when the irrigation season ends. Historically, the districts would reduce the flow out of Wickiup and Crane Prairie such that they would start storing water for the next irrigation season. But that's a really critical time for the frogs, because in the fall, the frogs that have now, either the young of last year or this year's young have reared, and they get these cues in the environment about time to move into their overwintering habitats. And this frog, as I mentioned, is entirely aquatic, but it needs to migrate into its overwintering habitat, which remains wetted all year long. And so, one of the measures holds flows up at a certain level at different gauges. There's gauges all over the gauges at the reservoir, gauges along the way. The measures are specific to flows at minimum flows at times of the year at different gauges. And so we hold those a little later to ensure the frogs have the opportunity to move into their overwintering habitats. And then we hold that flow stable over the winter. And as the years go on, those winter flows go even higher to provide that better connectivity between the wetland habitats and the overwintering habitats. Another topic is enhancing reservoir releases on down on Crescent Lake and Crescent Creek and into the Little Deschutes. In addition to just having minimum flow releases, we also have what we call a frog bucket of water. Not a very technical term, but what we found there is water is used out of Crescent Creek at a time when that's by Tumalo Irrigation District, one of the permittees. They have multiple water sources. So they also have irrigation rights on Tumalo Creek. But once Tumalo Creek, as it comes off of Broken Top, once that gets down to a certain flow level, they're not allowed to divert water off of it anymore. So at some point, they switch from Tumalo Creek onto Crescent Creek for their irrigation purposes. Well, that timing of the year is really dependent on the type of water year and snowpack, et cetera. And so we have a bucket of water that we negotiated for Crescent Creek, so that depending on when that switch between Tumalo and Crescent happens, we might need some flows early in the spring to help the frogs during the breeding season if they're not switching over till later, or later in the season to help the frogs move into the overwintering habitat. So that one's a little more of an adaptive management ongoing measure. And we think that's for that particular system, that proved to be a better strategy. And then in addition, we have the Upper Deschutes Conservation Fund that provides $150,000 per year tied to an inflationary index for the next 30 years that will go exclusively to Oregon spotted frog conservation projects in the Upper Deschutes. There's a variety of things we can do right away for spotted frogs. Some things will take longer though. So in the early years, we likely anticipate we'll be doing bullfrog removal and reed canary grass removal. Bullfrogs are a real threat to spotted frogs. I think I saw Jody Wilmoth log on here earlier, and she could give all of us a tutorial on this, but essentially bullfrogs are a tremendous predator for spotted frogs, and we definitely need to remove them from their habitat where they coexist, because they are extreme predators for spotted frog. So in the early years, we anticipate using that fund to do work to remove predators and remove other threats, whether that's, I mentioned reed canary grass. That is an invasive weed that moves into wetland habitats and sort of chokes out the native vegetation and sort of outcompetes that area, so that we don't have that kind of natural native species wetland habitats that the frogs like to get into for breeding and then shelter. So we anticipate doing that. And then in the long run, we anticipate doing things like major restoration activities. And we think that that might look like perhaps in the installation of beaver dam analogs to help the structure, to help hold the water in places where we need it to be held, to optimize the flow with the vegetation, to provide the most suitable habitat that we possibly can for frogs. We also anticipate doing lots of riparian planting and other types of large-scale restoration. When I mentioned earlier that the river is physically different than it was prior to the installation of the dams, it's going to take some time for the river to heal as we move from the high summer flows to a more balanced system. And that's really the long-term goal for the spotted frog, to really, like right now, as I mentioned, we have these low flows in the winter and very high flows in the summer. And over time, we're going to bring those winter flows up and cap those summer flows so that we don't have quite that variability that has that real scouring effect up on the Upper Deschutes in particular. And so the Conservation Fund will help do very site-specific projects, primarily adjacent to the spotted frog breeding sites, but not necessarily, so long as it provides a conservation benefit to the frog, we'll be able to use those funds. Moving on to bull trout. So I'm now down in the middle to lower portion of the basin. So here you can see up here that, so this map shows, actually this is the whole basin, excuse me. This map shows the historic and the current distribution of bull trout. So this red line that you see up here above Big Falls, that's the historic distribution of bull trout. We don't have bull trout up there now. We do have bull trout down in, I don't know if I can see it here, Odell Lake, but that's off and on the other side of a lava flow now. So, but bull trout are in the Crooked River. They are in Waichus Creek, and all of these other tributaries that you see adjacent to that feed into the Deschutes, and again flow out into the Columbia River. We're very fortunate on the bull trout side in that we have the Metolius. The bull trout population here is part of the lower Deschutes population, and the Metolius is an extraordinarily productive bull trout area. And so we're very fortunate that the bull trout in our basin are actually in very good shape. And I'll contrast that to the spotted frog in that the spotted frogs generally are in very poor shape. They've been in decline for decades, but they have continued to decline since we put them on the endangered species list in 2014. And that's really one of the reasons why when we talk about the difference in the measures, one, you'll notice that they don't occur in the same area. The spotted frog is in the upper basin and bull trout are in the middle and lower basin. But as I describe it to friends and family, I would say the conservation lift for spotted frogs was much, much harder to achieve than it was for bull trout. Bull trout are in a healthy status already. The area affected by the water management is actually not spawning habitat for the bull trout. They spawn in the Metolius, as I mentioned. So the area affected by the water management is not the prime habitat for bull trout. So from a conservation standpoint, it was a little easier to design a conservation strategy to address the impacts to bull trout than it was for the spotted frog. And generally, again, these are general terms. All of this is in the document, which I'm happy to share. The strategy for bull trout is really about providing minimum flows out of Bowman Dam, through the Crooked River, Ochoco Creek, Mackay Creek, in particular, and also on Waichus. And I'm going to talk about the Crooked River first, and then I'll talk about Waichus separately. And the Crooked River gets complicated in a hurry, and because the management of water out of Bowman Dam with Prime River Reservoir and into the Crooked River is not only managed by the irrigation district, it's also actually the Bureau of Reclamation has a very strong role in the Crooked River. The Bureau of Reclamation holds the water rights and the storage rights and manages the flow. Now they contract that to Ochoco Irrigation District, which actually opens and closes the reservoir, but Prineville is a federal facility. The other facilities we talked about, while they were owned by the Bureau of Reclamation, they are operated and maintained by the irrigation districts. Every one of these different facilities has a different level of federal involvement. Crescent Reservoir has no federal involvement. Prineville Reservoir has full federal involvement. The upper Deschutes reservoirs have very small amount of federal involvement. And that matters because I mentioned at the very beginning that a habitat conservation plan is sort of the corollary to consultation with federal agencies. So when we got into the Crooked River portion of this habitat conservation plan, we actually had a lot of Bureau of Reclamation activities that were already underway. And so the measures for the conservation strategy sort of sit right on top of the existing water management strategy there. So I could talk about this stuff for hours in any level of detail that folks want, but I'm going to try to keep it just very straightforward here so that it's not too wonky and lose interest. So in general, though, we have worked to ensure that winter minimum flows are established. And that was one of the primary measures for the Crooked River that we were really focused on. And that is about ensuring that I'll just say if there is no federal water, because there's some federal water I mentioned as sort of a baseline already. If there is no federal water for us to provide flows sufficient for winter, the conservation strategy of the HCP requires the irrigation districts to provide winter minimum flow in the Crooked River. And historically, that's been as low as 10 CFS. The conservation strategy now would require that minimum of at least 50 CFS for the entire irrigation season. Now, typically we have federal water, I'm just going to call it for simplicity, and we always target closer to about 100 CFS in the winter because we like that higher. But the minimum that we knew that that we could sustain in a dry year like we're having this year was down at 50 CFS. We also have established minimum irrigation season flows, and that's really around, again, different gauges in different places and certain flows that are required throughout, whether, again, Ochoco, Mackay, or the Crooked. We also negotiated the protection of downstream pulses of flow. So in the Crooked River, there's irrigation water, all the different water. It regrettably doesn't come with different colors. We sort of laugh about that all the time, like there's this water and that water. And frankly, fish don't care, but certain water can be diverted and certain water cannot be diverted. And so one of the things we negotiated was including protecting the water from diversion for downstream pulses. The PGE and the tribe and our colleagues at ODFW are doing salmon and steelhead reintroductions. And so they plant smolt up in the Crooked River, and we want to make sure we can give them a healthy push on the way out. And we did that last year when we had more water in the system, and the numbers were phenomenal. It was really a very positive correlation between the increase in flow and the number of fish that found their way through the system. So that was fantastic. There's a couple of different conservation funds also on the bull trout strategy. Some for in the Crooked River, that's more about water leasing. And then other, again, I'm going to come to Waichus in a moment. And then in addition, in the Crooked, there's support for screening of diversions, modifying those to a certain standard, and then a whole host of other ramping measures, meaning like how fast flows can go up and down. And similarly in Waichus Creek, we have ramping measures, we have minimum flows, we have a water leasing fund, and we also have a water, an in-kind restoration project fund. We know in Waichus Creek that there are great opportunities for physical habitat restoration, and those that have occurred already have delivered fairly significant, nice pools and riffles and really good quality habitat. And so our goal for Waichus is to really establish those minimum flows and then do the habitat work that we know can really make a difference over there. There is also, like any HCP, this one comes with a pretty significant reporting and monitoring requirement. Again, this is in the last couple of pages of the document that we'll share, but it essentially requires, I'll start with, there's an annual report at the end of the year where they go through all of the measures, all of the compliance, all of the gauges, all of the, like sort of a detailed report of how the flows were managed consistent with the plan. There is also a component of the HCP that requires real-time reporting if they're beyond allowable deviations. Many of these gauges, we know what their sensitivity is, and so we set a range. So if something is 100 CFS minimum flow, we might have a plus or minus 10 CFS allowable range around that. We know you can't always land exactly on a particular number, but if you get outside that to a certain level, there's a trigger that has either a 12 or 24-hour reporting requirement that triggers a conversation with us about how to remedy that, what is the effect of that, and what should be done to minimize or to mitigate any of the effects from that. There is also considerable biological and habitat monitoring that occurs. We're just coming through the completion of the spotted frog survey season. And in addition to biologists from our office, the Forest Service, USGS, the permittees have an obligation to fund biologists to support that effort, that qualified biologists that participate on those surveys. There's also habitat monitoring. So when certain, and this is all part of the adaptive management component. I mentioned in the spring, especially in the upper Deschutes, there's a lot of stabilization or a lot of conversation back and forth about, we're at this flow, can we go a little higher? It's like, okay, we'll go look at the habitat, tell us what it looks like, and take pictures and monitor that. And so there's a lot of that kind of real-time monitoring and real-time conversations. I think I realized I will likely not be taking any vacations in April in the future, because that's April and May is when there's just a constant dialogue between us and the permittees on implementation of the HCP, which is typically at the beginning a little more challenging, but once we get into the out years, it should get easier. There's also habitat assessments that are done on periodic basis so that we can evaluate whether the measures that we've put in place are providing the type of habitat response that we want. So all of that, again, that's sort of just a snapshot of it, but then all of that gets rolled up into an annual report. It gets submitted to the service. We review that, and then we will, if there's any corrections or questions we have, we might spend a little time to get it ready to be considered final, and then we would publish that on our HCP website. And speaking of, I know folks, I think many folks are aware of this website. It's where all of our HCP documents have been shared and posted. We've got all the HCP itself, the NEPA documents, which was the environmental impact statement. We have the findings, we have the biological opinion. There's actually a really, really cool frog video. It's about 7 or 8 minute frog video on there. That's really fantastic. But that's our go-to place for all information. And one of the things we're working on right now that I was hoping was going to be ready for tonight, but it's not, is a web-based application where you go on our website and they'll say, like, what's required where, and they'll just bring you up to a map that you can click on and say, like, oh, here's WikiUp Reservoir, I'm curious what's required there. And when you click on it, it'll bring up the list of all of the very specific language in the measures. And so trying to make it and then with links to the gauges, right? So you could say, like, oh, I see it's supposed to be at 600 right now. What is it right now? And oh, okay, it's it's 610. That's great. And so people can look for it themselves, because we've had a lot of folks say, like, I want to know I want to look too, and I don't want to wait for the annual report. So we're trying to get that up and running and have that ready for folks to. But it'll all be on that main website. I'm happy to, maybe we can just put that in the chat. It might be easier than folks writing down that long name. I apologize for its length, but it's one of many pages on our website. So that is the end of my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and happily to start taking some questions.